Hi everyone, welcome to FTInsights. I'm Mike Fibus. Today we're fortunate to have with us Drew Schiller. Drew is co-founder and CEO of Validic. Validic's platform, you might say, is something of a liaison between the electronic health record and patient-generated data, from everything from smart watches and fitness bands to apps and home health instruments like Holter monitors. That just gives him a great perch to see what's coming. Drew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us about what you're seeing now. I mean, I'm seeing some advances in accuracy, some efforts to get more insight out of the data. Tell us about the kinds of things you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting time. You know, I'm seeing a lot of the consumer technology companies that have created consumer wearables really look a lot more into either clinical solutions or software solutions to supplement the more consumer grade product that they've had in the past. So one of the challenges I think that all of these organizations have faced is comments around, you know, how accurate are these devices, especially when you compare them to other devices themselves, right? So, you know, if I wear two wearables on my wrist from different manufacturers, I might get varying degrees of accuracy, or at least of data reported from those two devices. And that's been a challenge plaguing the industry for a while. So a couple of things are happening. The first thing that's happening is that there is some industry effort around standardizing some of the metrics that are coming off of these devices. So, for example, I'm on the Consumer Technology Association Health and Fitness Technology Board, and that group has a corresponding standards division. Now, CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, this is the group that runs CES in Las Vegas every year. So this is the big international organization that all these companies belong to. So the standards group is that we actually created over the course of the last year or so a physical activity monitoring standard around the wearable trackers, so that they can all meet some minimum threshold and receive a certification. It's a self-certification to show that, you know, for walking and running, there is some level of effort there to be within a threshold of accuracy, which is really important. And now that same group is tackling heart rate concerns across the broad spectrum of wearables to define not just what heart rate should look like, but really what the minimum threshold for acceptable tolerance should be for those. So that's a really important step. But we're also seeing, you know, instances like Jawbone, for example, is, you know, shutting down and relaunching potentially as a clinical type of product, where, you know, there hasn't been a ton of public information out there, but that's kind of what some of the rumors are. And then we're also seeing other organizations that, you know, have developed some secret sauce as part of their technology offerings, and now are looking to license that out as a software platform, which is a really interesting model as well. So I think that the industry, especially the consumer technology and wearables industry, is really kind of in flux as they try to find their footing. You know, we've seen a lot of the companies that are on the public markets have had some challenges, and I think that that's reflective of the industry as a whole as it tries to mature.
Yeah, really good point. In fact, I spoke with Jim Malt, you know, for FTInsights a couple of weeks ago. So we spoke a little bit about that, and it hadn't occurred to me that anybody would care how accurate steps were. Heart rate, yes. But so we had a good discussion about why that matters and to whom. Are you seeing, I mean, it has been a struggle to get wearables in particular into the clinical workflow. And certainly one aspect is accuracy. Another is insight as opposed to a flood of data. Are you seeing anything new down that line?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. So it's accuracy, it's insight, and I think it's also engagement. And so I want to talk about both insight and the engagement piece. And I'll start with the engagement piece. There's actually a great article in the Atlantic just last week about the challenge that wearable device manufacturers are having with driving meaningful engagement with consumers beyond you know, a relatively short period of time. We've talked about this for years now. You know, generally speaking, it's called time to drawer. So what are the things that, you know, wearable device manufacturers can do to actually keep the individual consumer engaged beyond some minimal level of effort? And I think that that's still something that really the industry is working to resolve as a whole. And frankly, I don't think it's something that the wearable manufacturers are going to be able to solve on their own in a clinical context. I think it's really going to have to be the wearable combined with a program of care from a clinician where the care management team and the patient understand why there is a wearable device in conjunction with potentially, other clinical data points that are being brought in, and how that can ladder up to an overall improvement in the patient's quality of life. I think that if you can wrap it into something like that, I think that there's a much broader opportunity for engagement. I think that really gets to the insights piece. So, one of the biggest challenges with the continuous data from wearables, frankly, is that it just doesn't fit inside of the clinical workflow. So if you look at the electronic health record systems that are, I would say fortunately predominant. I mean, 90+% of all physicians in the United States have some sort of electronic health record today. EHRs, by their very nature, are episodic in how they look at data. So they're very encounter focused. You have the notion of a patient coming in for a visit, and there are readings associated with that visit. And really, outside of that, there's not an opportunity to bring in a lot of data outside of that encounter. And so the way we look at Validic is you have continuous data on one side, and you have episodic data on the inside of the health system. So how do you map those two? And kind of the way I like to think about it is you have to turn the continuous data into relevant information that can be driven, that can actually drive those insights. So information, from data could mean that a particular value, let's say, if it's a physical activity, a particular value could be let a clinician or maybe a care manager in a disease management program know that the patient has exceeded their 5,000 step goal. That would be an important thing if you want to send a kudos out to the patient, right? So don't just send a bunch of step data, send a notification that, hey, the goal was reached, right? That's something that someone can actually take action on. Another type of information from data could be a trend, might be important in that instance if we're talking specifically about activity, to look at, hey, there's been a 20% decrease week over week in the level of activity from this person. Likewise, if we're talking about, hypertension or diabetes, it might be important to note that a threshold has been exceeded for blood pressure, or that, 3 glucose readings in a row have fallen outside of a range. And then the third type of information from data is really thinking through what happens when someone falls out of compliance, right? And so we talk a lot about medication adherence. Well, we don't really talk about program adherence, which is, I think, really what we're talking about is adherence to a program of care when we're talking about engagement and adherence. And so it might be really important to say, hey, it's actually important to note that, this hypertensive patient hasn't recorded a blood pressure reading in the last 72 hours. That's the absence of data, but really important information. Or likewise, if you have, a patient who's in a activity program, it might be important to note that, hey, this person has been under 2,500 steps for 72 hours. Might be a good point to check back into that person and make sure that everything is okay.
Right. And I mean, in a sense, in all three of those cases, it's turning continuous data into episodic so that it can be digested by the EHR, right?
That's right. Yep, that's exactly right.
So are you starting to see signs of, of this kind of activity? Are there particular conditions that you mentioned, diabetes? Are there conditions that are hitting first, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing a lot of really interesting traction. I'll give an example. At a high level, certainly we're seeing conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, probably COPD, and then we're also seeing a lot of the talk around readmissions work for heart failure and other more post-acute settings, such as joint replacements, things like that, where these type of thresholdings could be really important in the clinical context. But one great example of this is some work that we just completed with the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, the ONC, in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So for the last 2.5 years or so, they've been really looking at patient-generated health data and how that can actually improve the quality of a patient's life inside of the healthcare system. And so about a little over a year ago, through their partnership with Accenture Federal Services, they put out a request for a contract for a pilot demonstration to show how this data can actually impact patient care. So in conjunction with a partnership with Sutter Health, Validic submitted a bid and was selected. And what we did was we created with Sutter a type 2 diabetes management program. And it showcased how a diabetic patient's care can really improve by connecting these devices inside the four walls of the healthcare system. And I'll tell a quick story about that. So there's one of the patients, this was actually very cool, toward the end of the program, we actually got to do a site visit, and we got to do, we got to talk about tech, which was really cool, but then we also got to meet the patients who were in the program, as well as the clinicians who were participating. And that was a really meaningful thing. As a technologist, you don't always get direct feedback from the patients who are benefiting from your work, and this is one of those instances where we did. And so one of the patients, we'll call him Michael, it's not his name, but we'll call him Michael, 51-year-old diabetic. He said, look, every single person in my family who's ever had or who's ever reached the age of 40 has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. You know, my dad, my brother, my sister, my grandma. I turned 40, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And so, he exercises every day, he tracks his glucose, he eats as healthy as he can, but there's a genetic component there. And his challenge was he was seeing this endocrinologist for years, and he was never able to control his A1C. And so even though he was taking his glucose readings regularly, well, the way his condition was being managed is he would go into his endocrinologist every 6 months or so. They would take a new A1C reading. That A1C reading then was what they changed his diabetes medication prescription based on, and then he was sent out on his way. Well, the problem is that he's taking data in real life every day, and so he actually turns to faxing a monthly report of his glucose reading into that endocrinologist to say, hey, look, is there anything I could be changing? Is there anything I should be doing? Can you change my medication based on my real-time data? And to which the endocrinologist, didn't know how to trust the data, didn't know how to look at the data, so just kind of discarded it. And really frustrated, Michael left that endocrinologist and ended up going to Sutter, not knowing about this program. But 2 weeks after he joined Sutter, he enrolled in this program that we were putting on with the O&C. And so as part of this program, he connected his glucose meter, a weight scale, a blood pressure monitor, a nutrition app, as well as a physical activity tracker. And so he's bringing all this data, and it was all going inside of Sutter's Epic instance, which was really important for the state. And Michael's like, look, if that's all you guys did, I would have been thrilled, because it's just nice to know that my data is going somewhere that matters. But it turns out that about 2 weeks into the program, the diabetic nutritionist who was in charge of this care program, called Michael and said, hey, look, just want to call and see how things are going. Your glucose readings are looking good. You're exercising. You're eating pretty well. But what's going on between 7 and 9 p.m. at night? Because, your glucose is spiking even though you're not recording any food. So we're just trying to figure out kind of what's going on. So they talked about it for a little bit, and Michael said, what I realized, I'm a snacker. Like my kids are in college, but they live at home. At night we're watching sports or watching TV, whatever. There's chips, there's popcorn. I grab a handful and I kind of munch. And it turns out that was enough to really cause Michael some problems. So he cut that out, and within 30 days, his A1C dropped by 0.5 point, which is just like a tremendous level of change in a very short period of time for one simple behavior metric. And, oftentimes when we think about, the technology and what can we do from a technology perspective and what kind of data analytics can we put on top of things and everything, this is an instance where there was actually very little, if I would argue probably no, technology innovation here. I mean, all we did was get the data from Michael into the EHR, into the clinician's workflow, where the care management team could look at it. And there was a massive, impactful life change that was made for this individual. And by the way, there were 32 individuals in this program, and there were other similar stories. And so, this is an instance where, I think that we often in healthcare talk a lot about innovation and all the things we can do, but really I think that we have so much technology that can be impactful today. We just don't use it properly. It's not implemented and integrated in a way that clinicians and care managers and other folks inside of healthcare can use and make a truly impactful experience. So I call this concept invisible healthcare, where you basically take the data that are available that's available today as part of the patient's daily life, and you just make it so simple for them to use that it just becomes invisible. Just like we use wireless or keyless entry on our cars. We don't think about that as technology. It just works. Like same thing. Like how can we make, you know, the tracking of food or the tracking of glucose or the tracking of blood pressure or steps, et cetera, just so easy and also beneficial for the patient that it's become seamless and part of their daily life.
Yeah, that's a good story. And I mean, there's so much simple insights many times that you can garner just from recording and the awareness that you glean. It's many times it's simple but very effective. And yeah, so I think in many ways it's the software trailing the hardware, as you said. I mean, do you see more instances? Do you think that's starting to come more into balance?
You know, I do. I mean, I will say that a lot of the conversations that I have with folks on both sides of this equation, so with the device manufacturers themselves, both clinical as well as consumer device manufacturers, and with folks inside of the healthcare system, there's a lot of talk around how can we make these data actionable for care managers, for clinicians, and importantly, how do we actually bring this data in a way that's actionable and not burdensome, and if we can, even maybe remove some of the burden. One of the things that's happened in healthcare that's really frustrating for me as a technologist is that technology is supposed to make our lives easier. But in healthcare, so often technology has been implemented in such a way that it becomes a real burden. And, you know, I think there's a lot of culpable entities in that. You know, there's regulatory factors that are culpable because of how they've sort of required certain things to be entered during the patient visit, so that, you know, clinicians actually have to spend as much time with their computer screen as they do with the patient in the patient visit in order to make it sort of a meaningful visit. But then there's also, you know, challenges and burdens with, you know, just the EHR workflow and how things are implemented. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not pointing fingers, but as a technologist, it frustrates me that, you know, technology should be something that makes our lives simpler and easier and enables us to do more. And so I'm hoping that we're going to start to see that trend in healthcare where, you know, within a few years' time, clinicians are going to be saying, wow, you know, this new technology really made things a lot easier for me to see more patients, a lot easier for me to provide better care, et cetera. So that's really where I feel like this has to go in order to service patients in the way that they deserve.
You know, the first targets, as you intimated, are chronic conditions, diabetes, COPD, asthma, and things like that. There's also obviously an important component of keeping healthy people healthy. And thus far, it seems to me that that's being taken on more by corporate wellness programs and the payers than actual healthcare system. It's simpler. They doesn't have to be FDA approved and things like that. Do you agree, first of all? And second, do you see a transition into the healthcare system of healthy for healthy?
Yeah, I do. I'll say provisionally yes to both of those, and I'll add some caveats. So first of all, I mean, absolutely. There's, you know, the corporate wellness space is really interesting. One of the most interesting things about that space is that we're starting to see a lot of consolidation as folks try to really figure out sort of how to make a bigger play, because it's been a very fragmented industry. In fact, very, very old data here, but 5 years ago when I was doing a lot of research into this space, at that time, the largest corporate wellness vendor that I could find market share wise had 4% of that was Healthways, and they had 4% of the market, and that was the largest. And so it's an incredibly fragmented marketplace. We started to see some consolidation there, and I think that that's going to probably be overall a good thing for the industry as they align with payers or provider systems. So a couple things. First, the reason why I actually think it's important that employers self-insured employers remain in this equation as sort of the technology purchasers here is because more so than any other party, so more so than the payers and more so than the providers, the self-insured employers have actually a longer term incentive to keep their employees healthy and engaged. So I say that because you can, every year you can change your TPA benefits manager. You know, a patient can sort of change providers, right, based on kind of where they need to go or whatever. But generally speaking, folks will stay at an employer longer, especially if they feel like they're, you know, supported as an employee. And so as an employee benefit, I think that this is there's a lot of sort of intrinsic incentive to keep employees healthy and active. The other thing is that, and why I think that we're going to start to see some sort of blending from the wellness vendors into both the payers, but also more into the providers, is we're starting to see payers and providers aligning more naturally as is, right? We're starting to see more of the kind of mini integrated delivery networks starting up, and payers and providers joining forces in new ways. And I think that wellness is going to become a real differentiator in a competitive healthcare market where, you know, I gave the example of Michael, who was seeing an endocrinologist, did not feel like he was getting the care that he wanted. So he went across the street to another endocrinologist who was able to get him into a really groundbreaking program. And so I think that, you know, that really underscores the consumerization of healthcare. And as consumers start to be able to really choose and direct their own care, as we have a more, you know, HSA-driven, risk-bearing driven economy for healthcare, I think patients are going to say, hey, look, these are my healthcare dollars. I'm not getting the care that I need. I'm used to technology just working for me. Why isn't technology available in healthcare? And going and finding the providers and the payers who are actually delivering that for them.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, I've spoken with United Healthcare for FTInsights, and they made the point that, you know, their Trio Motion Fit program is helping them retain business because the employees are asking for it to continue.
Absolutely. Well, and look at what is it, Aetna, who's looking at doing a partnership potentially with Apple. It's a rumored partnership where, you know, all of the members would get an Apple Watch. I mean, if you want to talk about beyond healthiness, right? Beyond fitness, that is just a really interesting strategy for employee benefits. I mean, imagine if your benefits program were up for your employer next year, and they're looking at this and they say, well, hey, you know what, if we switch over to Aetna, all of our employees get an Apple Watch, and then all of a sudden it comes in like as part of a recruitment effort, hey, you join us, our benefits plan gives you a free Apple Watch. Like, that's a really, beyond how much it impacts my health, that's just a really interesting way to engage employees around their benefits. So I think I don't think that in and of itself is a long-term sustainable thing, but it's an interesting sort of economic twist on kind of based on where we are in the US today.
And also, I mean, I think, you know, you had mentioned compliance earlier, and I think ultimately that will become an ever-increasing piece of this, particularly if pre-existing conditions, you know, remains to be not a factor in health insurance. You know, whether you have diabetes is not an issue. It's whether you take care of yourself that is. And if you're not, it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah, 100%. I think that what we're going to find is that over time, I do firmly believe that that the move toward value-based care is just going to I think the ship has already left the harbor on that. It's already set sail. I think it's going to be a longer, slower voyage than maybe we would all like, but I think that this is all part of it, in that you know, we have to find those engagement strategies. And by the way, I think that, you know, if we look at, you know, Apple and Google and Samsung and Amazon and Microsoft and all these companies, these traditional consumer technology companies that are starting to really play in this space and make pretty big bets, I think that's really exciting, because these companies have made their bread and butter on the fact that they can engage consumers with some sort of behavior change in that, you know, it's using their technology. I mean, if you think, you know, back 15 years ago, maybe we would use Amazon for buying a book, but really nothing else beyond that. And now, you know, it's something to the point where, you know, I'm using Amazon regularly to, you know, order diapers for my infant, or, you know, order new paper towels, or, you know, play, Spotify for my 3-year-old, or whatever it is through the Alexa, right? So there's so much that you can, that you do now with Amazon, and it's just like, if they can take that type of engagement and behavior change strategy and apply that to healthcare in a meaningful way, I think that's just going to reap dividends for the entire country.
Yeah, totally agree. So we're about out of time, Drew. What can't you believe I didn't ask you?
You know, I can't believe that you didn't ask me where Validic fits into all of this, because, you know, I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of the industry, and Validic is an interesting player because we don't make a device, and we don't provide, you know, like a full-on engagement solution for the market. And so, you know, it's sort of an interesting, Validic sort of sits in an interesting place. I'll say that where I think Validic fits into this whole equation is that Validic is the enabling technology that will help make the wearables and the clinical devices actually develop, or actually turn that concept of invisible healthcare into reality. And so Validic will enable the device manufacturers and the providers to create a seamless experience for the patient, as well as for the provider and the care manager. And we'll just be kind of that invisible framework and that glue behind the scenes that's making all of that happen through data flow and smart alerts and really powerful engagement strategies.
Okay, great. Thanks again for your time, Drew, and your insight. This was great. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep. And thank you for watching. Until next time, bye-bye.